Chris, so good to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
I find myself thinking about going back to following even just how crucial time has been in your movies, and not just the way time plays out in a film, but the way you go from the character's perception of time to real time in the film. And that's a fascinating way to think about your filmmaking, isn't it?
I'm very interested in the subjectivity versus objectivity in movie storytelling. And I think time is really one of the most peculiar and hard to hold on to subjective phenomena. You know, our sense of time changes right throughout the day, throughout our lives. I'm in my 40s now, and time is accelerating massively fast, So I think it is a pretty interesting phenomena to deal with in terms of when you're trying to highlight the difference between the fact that we view the world from a very particular and subjective point of view, and yet we all accept that there's this objective reality around us that we're attempting to understand and to grasp.
But films don't often do that juxtaposingly. They tend to do either one or the other. And you've gone, and certainly in the Batman trilogy, from us dealing with the character's perception of time to a ticking clock at the end of the films.
Well, I think one of the great uses of time in film noir and crime movies is always the ticking clock, that great tension. I was reading the other day that Fritz Lang claims to have invented the countdown, which I think is just a marvelous idea. I don't know whether it's true, but the idea that a filmmaker came up with literally the 10, 9, 8, 7, when you launch a rocket, because they knew if you started counting from 0 and went up, the audience wouldn't know when the countdown ended, so they went backwards down to 0. Like I said, I think that's a wonderful idea. If a filmmaker really did invent that, and if there was a filmmaker to invent that, it would definitely be Fritz Lang. But it really speaks to the use of time in these kind of films. You really want to try and ratchet things up. And in The Dark Knight Rises, we try and tell a very long time span for this genre. And then we try and really compress it and accelerate it towards the end. So time is very, very elastic in the film.
But it's an elastic concept for you in general, even going back to the first film, where you juxtapose your protagonist's perception of time to real-world time.
I think it is in all films. There's a very interesting relationship between real chronological time and the way you portray time in a movie. When you ask people who've seen a film, perhaps a film they know quite well, what's the time span of that film? How long would those events really take place? It's very rare that they can actually answer that question, unless attention is really specifically drawn to it in the body of the film. And certainly I watch a lot of films with my kids, and they often ask me questions about, well, hang on, is that day, is that night? And what they're drawing attention to, what they're noticing, is how flexible, how easily manipulable the concept of time is for storytelling purposes. In my films, I've tried to draw attention to that and use that for some kind of device, or some kind of narrative trickery sometimes, or just to draw attention to a particular element of the story.
It's the treatment. I'm passing time with my guest director, Christopher Nolan, whose new film as director and co-writer is The Dark Knight Rises. You can hear the show at kcrw.com. This is a point in the show you may be familiar with, Chris, where you get to tell the audience what the film is about.
Well, it picks up the story following on from Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, and we really tried to be true to not just sort of dropping what we'd done in The Dark Knight and picking up with a new Batman episode, if you like. It really is an attempt to continue and indeed finish our story. And for that reason, we pick up Bruce Wayne 8 years after the events of The Dark Knight. And the reason for that passage of time is we wanted to really look at the consequences of the actions that he and Commissioner Gordon took at the end of The Dark Knight. And for their sacrifice to have meaning, it has to have been successful. And so at least superficially, we're dealing with a Gotham that doesn't need Batman anymore. On the surface of things, looks much better. And so you've got a Bruce Wayne who has locked himself away in self-imposed isolation in a wing of Wayne Manor, much in the manner of Howard Hughes in his Las Vegas period. And really our story picks up with the idea of this is a guy who's, as Alfred said, hung up his cape and his cowl, but he hasn't moved on. He's sort of stuck in this moment in time, or this emotional phase of his life.
And, of course, there is his nemesis, Bane, who I'm fascinated by the villains you've chosen because they are in the Batman pantheon, the villains who have caused Batman the most fear. I mean, the villains have caused him to question what it is he does. And I wonder if that's kind of a motivating force for you.
Well, I think one of the most interesting things about Batman, Bruce Wayne and Batman, is you're looking at a guy who, particularly as Christian Bale has portrayed it, I find it a very moving struggle. It's a guy who has suffered this terrible trauma as a child, and he's filled with negative things. He's filled with anger and rage, a desire for revenge. But he has this very moving struggle to try and do something positive with that, to try and make something good from that. And so any time you can put him up against a threat, I think it's so much more interesting if the threat is not just to the safety and prosperity of the people of Gotham, but also a threat to his own philosophy, his own way of life, something that gets under his skin and in some way represents a path he could have taken.
Absolutely. Also, in some way represents something that he can't quite comprehend. I mean, these villains have been as much sort of spiritual forces as they have been physical forces. You know, there's the kind of the chaos, the id of the Joker, and then Bane is almost kind of a superego in terms of the precision. I mean, basically, if Bruce Wayne had no moral compass, he could be any of these people.
Definitely. I think very much so in the case of Bane, and one of the reasons we wanted to draw on Bane as a character and draw on his backstory is it does represent very clearly a flip side of Bruce Wayne. Without giving too much away about the story of the film, but there are real commonalities with where they've come from and how they've learned to deal with the world. And Bane is an absolute. He just knows exactly what it is he's doing, is completely convinced of the rightness of it in a very fanatical way, which is not unlike Bruce Wayne, Batman, when he's at his peak, in a sense, and he's very convinced by what he's doing. I think the difference with Bruce Wayne is he has people around him who will be a conscience for him, who will question what he's doing, particularly Alfred, and in the case of The Dark Knight Rises, very much Alfred, but also Commissioner Gordon, Lucius Fox, at various times in the three films. He has friends around him who will suggest to him that what he's doing is not necessarily entirely moral or sane.
But the Joker, to some extent, was that too, and Ra's al Ghul in the first film. I mean, these are all sort of, in some ways, parts of Bruce Wayne's personality.
I think the Joker is the most unlike him, actually, in a funny sort of way. He's the most opposite, yin-yang. The Joker is chaos and stands for pure anarchy. Bruce Wayne is incredibly focused and disciplined and has to create rules for himself. And that's why the Joker is able to get under his skin. But he's really very much the opposite. I think in the case of Ra's al Ghul and then very much in the case of Bane, they are very, very similar to Bruce Wayne in terms of the discipline, the focus, the commitment to a set of absolute values. And I think, for me, what I find frightening about Bane is I think in the real world that's where true evil comes from. It comes from people who are convinced of the rightness of what they believe at the expense of all other ethical and moral considerations.
But also it's interesting because these villains, one way or another, all have a specific understanding of fear, which questions the way Bruce Wayne, Batman, uses fear to combat criminals in his own way.
Well, one of the first things that we uncovered, in the history of the character, what makes Batman essentially, was the rationalization or the explanation, really, of why he gravitates towards the bat, the figure of the bat, the symbol of the bat. And in Batman Begins, it became an important thing to get across. There's an important scene in the jet between Alfred and Bruce Wayne after he leaves the League of Shadows, where he talks about the logic of becoming a symbol, why he has to become something more than just a man. And at that time, he hasn't figured out what that symbol is. But ultimately, when Alfred asks him, he says it's because he's afraid of bats. And so we started to weave fear into really every aspect of what Bruce Wayne has to deal with in the world. And so fear really underlies everything that goes on in the films.
It's the treatment of having a relaxing conversation about fear with Christopher Nolan. His new film as director is The Dark Knight Rises. You can also hear the show at kcrw.com. But I just find myself fascinated by that. It's Bruce Wayne is attempting to conquer this childhood fear, and I just found myself thinking, for some reason, of Corinthians 13. When I was a child, I thought as a child, I spake as a child. And that's fascinating because at a certain point, maturation has to come into this for you for this to make sense, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and I think to me, one of the sort of strangest moments in Batman Begins that people perhaps don't notice, I don't know, but when his father is dying, what he says to him to try and comfort him is, "Don't be afraid." And so obviously he's trying to comfort his son, but there's a sense in which you can look at Bruce Wayne's story. He follows that advice far too literally, and I think where we are in The Dark Knight Rises is we've arrived at a Bruce Wayne at the end who doesn't feel any fear at all, and sees strength in that. And I think the film, over the course of the story in The Dark Knight Rises, it starts to question the value of that assumption that by being completely unafraid, you will be stronger.
There's always this question in the movies, all the movies you've made, about day versus night. And the reason I started by asking you about time is at a certain point, almost all the movies, even the characters are kind of morally confused, and this sort of precipice between day and night, and us not knowing what time it is literally in the movie, and the characters not knowing what time it is either. And so much of Batman Begins, in fact, seems to take place this kind of netherworld between dusk and dawn.
Well, we took the approach in reintroducing Batman as a movie character. We took the approach of treating him like a vampire in Batman Begins. We said, okay, this costume, the idea that he's trying to be frightening visually and symbolically to his enemies would only work at night. And when we improved his costume greatly, we came back from The Dark Knight, we were able to redesign his costume completely and get it really the way we wanted it to be. The opportunity of showing it more was presented because it held up to greater scrutiny. And so he then starts to appear really at magic hour, if you like. You see him a little bit more in almost daytime. And then coming into The Dark Knight Rises, we felt that we'd earned the right to show him, running down the street in the middle of the daytime. That people accepted the costume and the iconography at this point. When I say people, I'm talking about the audience, but I'm also talking about the people of Gotham. And that let us tell much more of the story in the day.
You traded on the fact that in your career, you can basically use noir conventions in daylight. You do it in Memento. You did it to a great extent in Dark Knight when the Joker is wreaking some of his most horrific crimes during the day.
I think there's something more realistic about that to me somehow. I mean, we're fearful of the night in very primal terms, but I think that a lot of truly awful and terrifying things that happen in real life happen during the day. And so it's a type of imagery that I gravitated towards more and more over the course of the three films in an attempt to try and make the stakes that Batman was up against more and more terrifying.
Welcome back to The Treatment, which you can also hear at kcrw.com. You're listening to an interview with Christopher Nolan, director and co-writer of The Dark Knight Rises. It was recorded a few weeks ago for the Horrible Assault in a Theater in Aurora, Colorado. We were talking about before the break about noir and the kind of the pleasure you get in sort of playing with those conventions of noir. And by bringing a lot of the threat of noir into the daylight, you're playing with the way audiences take the movie in.
I think in a way you're playing with it. You're also looking back to, crime fiction of the past, the sort of Jim Thompson era. A lot of this great American crime fiction that film noir forms a part of and is based on did take place in the day, in the sort of dusty desert in the middle of the day, a small town in the middle of the day, the gas station, so forth. It's the language of James N. Cain and all these great novelists. And so I think what happens to a particular genre like film noir over the decades is it becomes increasingly stylized and, I suppose, cliched. And so I've always tried in my films, because they're all film noir. That's the genre I like to work in. That's what I respond to. But I sort of try to get back to the essence of what that can be and not necessarily look too much to the visual conventions or the traditional stylization. It's in much the same way, actually. I've talked a lot with The Dark Knight Rises about its relationship with silent films. I look back to Fritz Lang's films, particularly Metropolis. But you won't find much in the film that visually mimics Metropolis. You'll find more of, Blade Runner or Dr. Zhivago or these other films we looked at. So the relationship with Metropolis is much more just looking at what Lang did in terms of the relationship between the themes of the story that you're trying to get across and the architecture of the piece. That was something we tried to really get back to in this storytelling.
What were some of the other films you looked at to get ready for it? Because I found myself thinking a lot about Clockwork Orange in watching Dark Knight Rises.
We didn't watch Clockwork Orange, but once you've seen that film, it's always it's always there in the back of your head, even if you don't want it there. Battle of Algiers, actually, we screened, and that was a very big influence on some of the later parts of the film. And Dr. Zhivago, we screened. We were looking really for a way of approaching an inversion of society, a complete shattering of the structures of society that wouldn't relate to this sort of, I suppose, the post-apocalyptic kind of Mad Max, 80s era of that representation, which is very bleak, very depressing. We were looking to get a little more romanticism in it. Not necessarily more comfortable for the audience, but more epic, I suppose. We wanted it to have the quality of a historical epic. And I think the reason I keep mentioning Zhivago is because there are all kinds of visual devices that get across an incredible sense of the atmosphere of a city that has become completely changed in its structures. And we really tried to echo some of those things in this film, particularly with the empty streets and then very crowded interiors.
In the winter, and almost even Bane's coat in some way.
Well, Bane's coat very much, and there's a sort of a Russian revolutionary aspect to it, and then very much a French revolutionary aspect with the size of the collar and the cuffs and everything. And what Lindy Hemming, our costume designer, was able to do is to combine the romanticism of the French Revolution in terms of some of the forms of what he wears, like that coat. But it's made from the materials of a sort of World War II military. It's sort of cracked leather and sheepskin on the inside. And that, I think, allows us to do a bit of both things. It has a military credibility to it, and it looks appropriately aged and everything. But there is a little bit of romanticism to it. There are these scenes where he's just sort of presiding over things and the events that he's set in motion, in this very classical way, and we shoot him against a lot of Doric columns. That's sort of not towards classicism, but it's when I make it quite as simplistic as that, it's a bit reductive. But what Nathan Crowley and Kevin Kavanagh and myself are the designers, and what Nathan had brought to The Dark Knight was the sense of modernism, and he loves modernism and the simplicity of it.
It's the treatment. I'm talking costumes and production design with Christopher Nolan, whose new film is directed as The Dark Knight Rises. You can also hear the show at kcrw.com. When you said Dr. Zhivago, though, I guess there are a couple of things that come to me besides the way Lean uses the vistas and the developing sense of visual in the widescreen is there's also this kind of voluptuous sense of despair in Zhivago that you luxuriate in. And that's a big part of the emotional story in Dark Knight Rises.
And I think actually you've sort of put your finger on what I was trying to articulate in terms of not going for the post-apocalyptic bleakness, going for a sense of despair that is somehow, as you say, voluptuous. It's somehow you are able to revel in the contrast of these people's grand stories in this extraordinarily turbulent and historic time. And, to try and do that with a fictional set of events was a real challenge, but it's one that every different department, costumes, production design, cinematographer, they all rose to it. They got it, and they rose to it very, very grandly.
But there is that sort of sense of real emotional grandeur that I hadn't seen in one of your movies since Prestige, was also, I think, in some ways trades on some of the same emotional ground as does Dark Knight Rises.
I think one of the things I'm really going to miss about not dealing with these characters is when you take on these larger-than-life characters that the audience has a pre-existing relationship with, these icons, you're allowed to indulge in a kind of grand-scale emotional storytelling that you can't in other genres. That's what I've loved about telling these stories, and we really tried to push that as far as we possibly could with The Dark Knight Rises, because you're allowed to introduce an operatic quality to the storytelling that you wouldn't get away with it with new characters, with characters the audience had never met before. They'd question the scale of what you were doing or the extremity of what you're doing. With these icons, you really are able to create a very large story with very large emotions, and I've enjoyed that thoroughly.
It's interesting, so I just find myself thinking about sort of the duogonist in your stories. There's always the character, I think you brought up Guy, but I think of Joe Pantoliano as this sort of kind of relief and mirror, and Robin Williams in Insomnia is kind of a relief and mirror, and Bane being that here too. I've seen so many cases your protagonists have to have themselves questioned by the person doing damage.
I think it's one of the most interesting things you can do for a protagonist is to set a mirror in front of them. I think if they're encountering an antagonist who doesn't get them at all, is from a different planet essentially, and shares none of their values in any way, they're not going to be as threatening. I really enjoy telling stories where the protagonist is being undercut, is being undermined, and the villain is getting under their skin because they share knowledge, they share a point of view in some bizarre way, and the more bizarre in which you can find that relationship, I think the more fun you can have with it.
It's a treatment. We're talking duality with Christopher Nolan, whose new film as director is The Dark Knight Rises. You can also hear the show at kcrw.com. But I find myself so fascinated because I think that it creates a sense of theater for you, having two actors really go toe-to-toe, in this case physically, but also there is such an enormous emotional component in having these sort of dual protagonists going at each other, isn't there?
I think a lot of the films that I've loved from other people, in particular I would point to Michael Mann's Heat. You have the De Niro character, the Pacino character, and you spend a lot of time setting up the idea that you'd be pretty fascinated to see them sit down and have a cup of coffee together, which of course they do in that famous scene. And there's something simply delicious about that. And in fact, the Bond films, which I dearly love, there's a very traditional formula those films adhere to of Bond meeting the villain, playing a game with the villain, usually a game of cards or something, and then coming back into conflict at the end. It's pretty carefully laid out according to this really fun design, which is if you can set up a protagonist and antagonist who have a very interesting, contrasting view of the world and so forth, you start to create a great deal of anticipation about what they would say to each other if they were in the same room together. For me, that's always one of the more fun parts of the film. In the case of The Dark Knight, it was very much the interrogation scene with the Joker, and it was one of the first scenes we shot with Heath and Christian and Gary, and it was just an amazing thing to be a part of.
I guess I wonder what some of those scenes would be for you in some of your other films, because I do like those moments where the philosophical differences create these sparks. They tend to be, for me, in photographic terms, the simplest things. They tend to not be moments that are really kind of grandiose or have a lot of technique in them.
Yeah, I think one way or another, all my films seem to end with two guys talking in a corridor about strange things that have happened. And I try to think of Dark Knight Rises, we don't actually have them in a corridor, but pretty much every other film they do. Memento was the extreme of that, where I had this very long 9-page scene between Joe Pantoliano and Guy Pearce.
Which is a great scene.
I really enjoy that scene. I really love what they did with it. And we did stage it very simply, and Wally lit it very simply. And it just boils down to that concept that if you've done the rest of the story right, when you get to the end, you don't need an enormous amount of technique in a lot of ways. What you need is interesting characters talking about things that you want to know the answer to. I would also say, and it's a conversation I've had with my brother over the years that we're writing together, which is when you're dealing with action films, you have to view it as a piece of music. And so you want the crescendos in the right place, and you can't not have those. So the quiet moments essentially start to be influenced by the loud moments, even if they might seem more interesting or so forth. It's very easy with action cinema to be dismissive of the fireworks, in other words, but they are doing something. They do something powerful, and you get to use that. I mean, not unlike something I learned from Al Pacino when we were doing Insomnia together, is he would do a take where he would go very big with something, very large, quite over the top, shouting and so forth. And what he explained to me, and it turned out to be incredibly accurate and true, is that he would create a sort of peak of energy so that a minute or two later he would hit something very, very perfect in the quieter moment that follows it. And he would move that peak of energy through the scene. And so when you cut the scene together from 12 or 14 takes, you'd look very carefully and figure out where he'd really hit that quiet moment. And that's what the performance in Insomnia is made up from. And it was a fascinating thing with technique. And I think when you apply it to the way an audience experiences a large action film, you have to really try and be mindful of where those crescendos are coming and what they're going to mean to the feel of the quiet scene that follows.
You've been working with bigger and bigger canvases, and in terms of building the climaxes or the peaks in these musical movements that you're working on, you have to be careful to not exhaust the audiences, don't you?
Well, Either that, or as with Dark Knight Rises, you just go ahead and exhaust them.
But you can't exhaust them in the middle of the piece. You know what I mean?
No, you can't. You exhaust them at the end, and everybody comes out of the film thoroughly exhausted. And the same was true of The Dark Knight. And I remember describing the structure of that film to Alan Horn, who was then head of the studio, and explaining that it was going to be this white knuckle ride in the second half that never let up. And Dark Knight Rises has a slightly different rhythm, but in the case of all these films, you get to the last two reels and it's relentless. And what Hans Zimmer does with the music is relentless.
And what he does with the music basically almost complements the ticking clock aspect of the end of the films.
It does, and in fact, the tempo changes in the music and so forth in the last two reels of all three films are identical, because we've always sort of taken what we did before as a jumping off point for the rhythm. And I like to say to Hans, the last two reels of any of these movies, they become musicals. I mean, it's always there pounding away and sort of kicking you in the chest. It creates a kind of relentless quality that I think suits the climax of the type of story that we're trying to tell.
Well, you've exhausted me, Chris, and we're out of time.
Thank you, I think.
Thanks so much for doing it. It's always good to have you here.
No, it's fun to be back. Thanks.